Welcome to the Master the NEC podcast, the ultimate destination for anyone passionate about the electrical trade. Whether you're a seasoned electrician, an eager apprentice, or just someone who wants to dive deep into the world of electrical work, you've come to the right place. Join your host, Paul Abernathy, a true authority in the industry with over 38 years of trade experience, as he electrifies your mind with in-depth discussions, expert tips, and valuable insights that will keep you ahead of the curve. Each episode, Paul will illuminate the complexities of the trade, decode the National Electrical Code, and share the latest industry trends, all while empowering you to take your electrical career to the next level. So, gear up, plug in, and get ready to supercharge your knowledge, because with the Master the NEC podcast, the power is in your hands. Now get ready. Here is your host, Paul Abernathy.
Hello, what up everybody? Paul Abernathy here. Welcome to another episode of Master the NEC, the podcast where we talk about just about anything electrical, whatever you want to talk about, and submit it through Let's Ask Paul over on fasttracksystem.com. We're going to talk about it and we're going to break things down. And today is no exception to that. We're going to be talking about some changes that have taken place to Article 300 of the 2026 edition of the National Electrical Code. Now, there's been quite a bit of renumbering inside of Article 300. And I think one of the things that happens, I get a lot of calls from people and they say, Paul, I'm studying for an electrical exam and I really, I don't have the 2026 code book yet. But I'm going to be using the 2023 to take an exam. But I really want to know what things have changed when it comes to the 2026. And so we kind of been doing some videos around that, explaining some new articles. And if you haven't listened to it, I just recently did an episode explaining 624 versus 625 for EV vehicles and electric self-propelled electric vehicles. And I kind of broke it down with the more of a sticking more towards what you're going to see for the most part is EV vehicles, like Teslas and things like that. But today we're going to kind of look at Article 300 and see some of the significant things that have taken place. But we're going to start with the renumbering, because I think it's one of the things that you have to remember, that when you go look at the code, something may be there, and then you turn around and it's all of a sudden it's gone, and you think that it's gone from the code. You think, oh, well, they must have removed it. And that may not be the case, especially when you're looking at 2026 and there's a lot of restructuring. For example, calculations that were in 220 is now going to be in 120. Energy management is coming to 130. So, I mean, there's a lot of those shuffling around. And of course, we're working already on the 2029 edition, which is going to rechange all of this and really shuffle the deck. And add a bunch more chapters. And it's not to make it more complicated. The effort will be to try to make it easier to maneuver and understand the code. Technically, it's going to be the same technical material, but it's just how it's presented. It's going to probably try to make it a little more flowing format. But we start that journey in the 2026. So you do have to get familiar with some of these things. So let's kind of look at a little bit of the restructuring, and we'll go through these quickly. No sense in making this overly complicated. So what I'll do is I will tell you what the code section was in the 2023 edition, and then tell you what it is in the 2026. So if you're somebody that's making notes, and maybe you've got a 2026 and you don't want to go get a 2023, but you're going to be taking an exam and you want to use your 2026, even though maybe the test is not on the 2026. If you're in a state that allows you to write in your code book, then you might want to write these numbers down and while you're studying, so it can make it easier when you're going back and forth between code books, things like that. So anyway, let's go on and do some of these here and see if we can't just get us familiar with some of how things are moving around. So the first one, 300.4, which is protection against physical damage. You're familiar with that. 300.4 dealing with bored holes, parallel with framing members, through wood framing members, all that protection rules. That was 300.4 in the 2023 edition of the NEC. Well, that is now 300.6 in the 2026 edition of the NEC. So I just moved from 300.4, just went up to 300.6. The next one was 300.5 in the 2023 edition, and that was underground installations. Well, 300.5 in the 2026 edition is now for underground installation. It's 300.7. Okay, so that's just a little change for you. It's just moving a little bit, nothing dramatic as you see right now, just kind of jumping around a little bit for as far as the structure goes, keeping everything pretty close, but it's just moving around a little bit. The next one, the 300.7, that was in the 2023 edition of the NEC, which was raceways exposed to different temperatures. Now that is moved 300.9 in the 2026 edition. So there's been a movement there from 300.7 to 300.9. Again, generally in the same area, so it shouldn't throw too many people for a loop. The next is 300.8 under the 2023 edition of the NEC. That was other systems and raceways and cable trays. Well, that is now 300.10. Okay. Next is 300.9 in the 2023 edition of the NEC. That was raceways in wet locations above grade. Okay. And by the way, all raceways outdoors, below grade or above grade, are wet locations and require wet location rated products like THW N-2, XHHW, all those type of things. Okay. But the change is 300.9 is now 300.11 in the 2026 edition of the NEC. Okay. So 300.11 used to be securing and supporting, like above suspended ceilings, things like that. Well, that is now 300.13 in the 2026 edition of the NEC. Remember, you can pause this podcast at any time to catch up and kind of scrub back a little bit or whatever where you need. But what we're talking about is 300.11, which is now 300.13, and that is securing and supporting. And again, most of you are probably familiar with the securing and supporting, what happens in the rules when you're above a suspended ceiling and those type of things. That's, always been 300.11, but now it's 300.13. Next is 300.15, which is boxes, conduit bodies, and fittings. Right? That is now 300.17. So boxes, conduit bodies, and fittings was 300.15. It is now 300.17. Next, 300.18, which was raceway installations. Well, that has been moved to 300.20. Okay, so 300.20 is now raceway installation requirements, where it used to be 300.18. Now, that renumbering is important because someone that's applying a memorized 2023 citation knowledge path eventually are going to have to conform to the 2026, and these numbers change. So, as a code guy, when I'm teaching seminars, I'm traveling around the country or whatever I'm doing, we rattle off these code references. And of course, for us, it's changing, especially with the 2026. And of course, again, in the 2029, it's going to be dramatically different. Those little parlor tricks that we use where we're throwing out these code references because we work with them every day, it's going to get much more complicated, right? Because, again, things are shuffling around, things are moving, and, it takes a while. I mean, we've been doing this current flow, this current format for over a decade, really, when it comes to the NEC. So this is a dramatic change, and it's all kind of starting in the 2026 to culminate in a very radically different looking 2029 version of the NEC. Now, again, not removing the technical information, just restructuring everything. And for those that are upset about it, again, you really didn't need to memorize the code anyway, just as long as you have access to a code book and you know how to maneuver it, you know how to look up things, you know how to interpret things, you know how to use the index, the table of contents. It's really not going to matter. Things just get moved around, but the technical part's going to stay the same. Okay? You still submit technical changes like you always did through public inputs, public comment stages, NITMAMs. That's not going to change. It's just the structure. It's just a little different. Now, let's talk about some significant changes that people have to be aware of, because I want to kind of dip your toe in some of these 2026 changes when it comes to Article 300. The first one that's really going to come to mind, that it's not really like some of the changes that you might see are basic, just verbiage changes to make things flow better, more clarification. These are significant changes that we're going to talk about because they cover areas that either weren't covered before or needed additional clarity. Okay, so the first one is 300.4c. This is damaged conductors and wiring methods. Now, this is probably the most important change in Article 300. Why? Because this new rule states that conductors and wiring methods that are no longer suitable for use because of damage, and this can be from overheating, fire, corrosive influences, water, exposure, whether it's a new installation or an inspector encounters this on a subsequent inspection, and they notice this deterioration due to conditions of use, that they can say that it is no longer suitable for use, and then it has to be removed. So important words are no longer suitable for use. This rule does not necessarily say that that every cable that gets damp must be automatically replaced. There must be damage sufficient to make the conductor or the cable or the wiring method unsuitable for continued use. Now, this is going to be something that it's going to have to, at least we have it now. And as a wiring cable manufacturer, this gives us something to point to, because again, there are certain products that are designed for wet locations. There's certain products that are limited only to dry locations, like non-metallic sheath cable. And so having this clarification and then understanding exposure can really be important for manufacturers to give guidance, but also for the installer. Now, I want to make sure that everybody's clear that there are two informational notes that have been added here. And they're talking about the NEMA's Evaluating Water Damage Guide as well as the NEMA's Fire and Heat Damage Guide. Now, NEMA is not they don't put out standards that are enforceable. However, these are what's used to determine a lot of things. And the suitability of use, continued use, because these documents are put out by NEMA, and NEMA represents over 400 of the major manufacturers around the world, and collectively the vast majority here in the United States. And, I can tell you Prismium is part of NEMA, Southwire, Nexans, all of the major manufacturers of wire and cable are part of NEMA. Schneider is part of NEMA. Eaton is part of NEMA. Siemens, GE, all of them are members of NEMA, and they have code and standards professionals who will come together and give collective guidance, and they create these guides. And these guides will give recommendations for certain types of exposure. So now in the 2026 edition, we do have reference to these. Now, remember, informational notes are not enforceable alone, but if I'm an inspector and I'm looking at something and I would see a product that's being used in a condition that it was not rated for, and I know that the NEMA Evaluating Damage Guide tells me that it needs to be replaced based on the manufacturer, then that pretty much is something that I'm going to say, you know what? I'm not relying on those NEMA guides. So don't get on me about being informational note. No, I am not relying on it because I think it's now damaged. Prior to 300.4c being introduced, that created a lot of arguments in the field. Now with 300.4c, there is teeth behind it for a manufacturer to make certain recommendations about removing it, replacing it, or even giving permission to continue to use something based on it, the condition of use. So this is important, right? So what's important to understand is this gives the AHJ direct enforcement language rather than having to rely on general workmanship, listings and installation integrity provisions, or guesswork, okay? So it's extremely important to have this provision in there. Now, a mega ohm meter alone does not automatically override the requirement. That's an important thing. Somebody does a meg test and they come back and say, oh, it's damaged. No, That does not mean that. Okay? That means that it may need to reach out to the manufacturer to give additional guidance, because y'all know my position on these megging. I believe that a lot of it is misunderstood. I believe that if everything is insulated and all the return paths are non-conductive, then you may get a number due to capacitance. You may get a number due to sheer distance and resistance or impedance. And you may get something that makes you feel warm and fuzzy, but at the end of the day, in many cases, it's useless information. But you need to reach out to the manufacturer rather than just look at a number alone. And if I haven't said that for the last 15 years until I'm blue in the face, I know a lot of installations where the meg ohm readings were low and the product still works fine and it's been in service and it's perfectly fine, but nobody freaked out, okay? So I'm just saying, the manufacturers can be your friend. If you have the right connection, you can reach out to them. Most of the manufacturers want to help you. Okay. But if the product is no longer suitable because of its contamination, exposure, corrosion, evidence of heat damage, compromised construction, then replacement is going to be required now based on 300.4c. So that's a good thing. It gives some guidance now rather than that gray area. Okay. The next change is 300.6e. This is the roof deck protection now applies to all roof decking. Okay, so not just to metal corrugated sheet roof decking. So in the 2023 edition, 300.4e, which it was in the 2023 edition, and I told you earlier that NAT's now 300.6 is covering all of those things. It said that primarily addressed the wiring installed under metal corrugated sheet roof decking. Well, the 2026 edition of the NEC says that requires wiring methods and materials installed under roof decking generally to maintain at least 1.5 inches of separation from the lowest surface of the roof decking. Therefore, the protection no longer is limited to just metal corrugated roof decks. It can be applied broadly, right, to wood decking, OSB roof decking, plywood roof sheathing, metal decking of various types, and other roof decking systems. So, what does this do? The prohibition against installing wiring methods concealed inside metal corrugated sheet decking, that remains. A new exception permits wiring methods and materials in concealed locations where encased in at least 2 inches of concrete, subject to accessibility requirements for boxes and obviously conduit bodies as well. So we still have those provisions in there. But again, we've expanded it out a little bit when it comes to protecting those wiring methods that are under roof decking to not just be limited to metal corrugated. Okay, now why does this even matter? Well, roofing nails, re-roofing screws, PV mounting. The hardware for PV mounting can penetrate the wood decking just as easily as it can metal decking. So it just made sense. So this is a major expansion that affects residential as well as commercial. So it's not just going to be limited to these metal corrugated sheet metal type decking. It's very broad now. Okay, so to me that's a significant change because we're seeing a lot more PV applications. We're seeing a lot more roofing that is not just metal corrugated sheet decking. Other types, and you know what? It's very hard to regulate the length of screws they use. And when they're putting in that, doing a re-roofing or putting down some, they just jam these things in there and you don't know what's on the other side. Okay. So it makes sense. Okay. All right. The next one to be aware of is 300.7D3. This is the warning ribbon expressly required over service raceways. Now, this formerly was 300.5D3, but as you remember, the 300.5 rules got moved to 300.7. So the 2026 language expressly requires that the warning ribbon over both, 1, direct buried service conductors, and 2, raceways containing service conductors. Okay, so again, direct bury SE. Okay, so it could be USE-2 directly buried in the earth, or raceways that happen to have service conductors inside of it. It doesn't matter. We're still going to have this warning ribbon over either of those. Now, the requirement applies where the installation is not encased in concrete, is buried 18 inches or more below the grade and has the warning ribbon installed at least 12 inches above the underground installation. Okay, now the 2023 wording referred to underground service conductors, but did not clearly resolve whether the parent language extended the requirement to service conductors installed in raceways, or was that only for direct bury type of installations like a USC cable. Okay, so that was removed, and that argument is removed with the 2026 edition. This is important because this is not a general warning ribbon requirements in every underground branch circuit and feeder. This is specific provision that addresses underground service conductors and service raceways. So let's not confuse this. Now, if you want to use a ribbon for feeders or branch circuits, and that's just your standard practice, and you want to do that, that's a classic example of going above what the code requires as a minimum. You can put the damn ribbon all you want, but it at least is required here when it comes to services, whether they're, again, direct bury or they're in a raceway. We're talking about service conductors, okay? Does it make sense? So that's kind of picking up somewhere that could be an argumentative thing between an electrical inspector and an installer and interpretation and service conductors. And it says, well, what if they're in a raceway? Because it didn't say it only applied to direct burial. You know what I'm saying? So now the clarity is there. It doesn't matter. Either or. Still got to have that ribbon if it's service conductors. The next one is 300.11b. And this is above ground raceways in wet locations must drain. Now, 300.11 now covers raceways in wet locations above grade. The existing concept remains that the interior of a raceway installed in a wet location is itself considered a wet location. Now, the new drainage requirements say that raceways in above ground wet locations must be arranged to drain. Okay, now think about the application here. This affects raceways installed in locations such as washdown rooms, because again, that's above grade, okay? Food processing areas, car wash facilities, indoor pools and similar wet environments, certain agricultural and industrial areas, okay? So how would I comply with this? Well, compliance might involve proper raceway slope, drainage style fittings, weep openings provided as part of the appropriate enclosure that these raceways drain to, or another approved installation that allows accumulation of moisture to escape. Maybe it's some type of fitting, or maybe it drains raceways with proper slopage, drains to an enclosure with adequate weep holes, that type of thing. Okay, so the key here is that wet location conductors alone are not the entire answer. When we're dealing with above grade, the raceway must also be installed so that the water does not become trapped indefinitely inside of the raceway. Okay? Makes sense? Well, yeah. And so there's many ways to achieve that. Whether it's, again, draining to equipment, draining to slope, draining to a box that has weep holes. There's many ways to do this, but you're going to have to make sure that it is put in place that way. Okay. The next one we'll look at is 300.13e. Now this one says cable ties used for support must be listed and identified. Now, cable ties used merely to bundle conductors are different from cable ties being relied upon for securement or support of wiring methods. Okay, now under the new 300.13e, okay, cable ties used to secure or support cables, flexible conduits, or flexible tubing must be listed and identified for securing and supporting. Cable ties fixed devices used for that purpose must also be listed and identified. Okay, so cable tie fixed devices or the cable ties themselves all must be listed for that application. Now, there is an informational note, and it explains that a Type 2S and a 21S are evaluated for securing and supporting cable, flexible conduit, and flexible tubing. Ordinary, inexpensive nylon Harbor Freight zip ties cannot automatically be treated as structural cable support. So an inspector is most certainly now going to be looking for these listings. Look for this Type 2S or 21S markings when it's going to be used to support cables. Okay? Doesn't mean you can't use cable ties, but it just means that you're now going to have to look for this listing. Okay? Now, why does this create an inspection problem? Because the listing and type designation may be shown on the package rather than molded into each tie, because the code is in the standard UL have allowed this for a very long time. As the components get smaller, there's really nowhere to put these markings. So the packaging has to have the markings, but that means that the inspector is not going to be able to look at that tie wrap, for example, and determine whether or not that one is a type 2S or 21S versus just a plain old generic tie wrap that you may be using for bundling, but you're not really using it for securing and supporting. So when that comes into play, the contractor may need to retain that packaging to be able to show the inspector. And this is not a new thing. This has been done a lot. There's a lot of smaller components that require the packaging to be retained in case the inspector asks something about it. So this isn't something really dramatically new when it comes to that, but it is something that you have to be aware of that's going to come your way. Okay, so that is definitely, don't get caught by that one. And again, this is very specific to that. So there's two things. There's a cable ties and there's cable tie fixed devices, both of which shall be listed and identified for securing and supporting if they're going to be used to support cables, flexible conduits, and flexible tubings. So just don't get nailed by that one. Put all these tie wraps up and then you're not able to show that they meet that type 2S or 21S. Okay, the next one may just seem like a no-brainer to most people. This is 300.20b, and previously this was 300.18. This is welding raceways is now completely prohibited. The 2026 NEC states that raceways are not permitted to be connected or supported by welding. Okay, now some people have looked at this through the years and it's like, how can it be not better supported or better connected by spot welding it? Well, previous language contained qualifications involving installations permitted elsewhere or raceways designed for welding. Okay, now those are now removed. The rule now says do not weld a raceway to connect it, terminate it, or support it. This addresses listings, conductor damage, mechanical integrity, and fault current path concerns. And this was all addressed by the Steel Tube Institute. So again, do not confuse this with welded supports or welding supports. This has to do with welding of the raceway. Welding a separate structural support, a bracket, or rack is not necessarily the same as welding a raceway itself. So again, you need to differentiate what we're talking about here. You're not welding the wiring method, the raceway, to secure it to something. You actually can weld supports, but ultimately the supports are doing what? They're holding the wiring method. Now, welding a separate structural support, like we said, a bracket or a rack, is not necessarily the same as welding the raceway itself. The prohibition is directed at connecting or supporting the raceway by welding to the raceway, not to another separate type of support that may be okay to weld, okay, like a rack or a bracket. That's different. That's not the raceway. And this rule here is dealing with metal raceways, okay? Keep that in mind. It should be obvious, but again, sometimes it takes that language to clarify that a bracket is not a raceway, okay? And by the way, a cable tray is not a raceway. It's a support system, okay? Very important distinction that just because you look at a cable tray that you assume that that's a raceway. It is not. Granted, it's got its own rules that have to be followed, but it is not in itself a raceway. It is a support system, okay? Distinction. And of course, you can learn all that by joining our Fast Tracks program and learning the NEC. So I encourage anybody out there, if you really want to learn the National Electrical Code, we have some great programs over on fasttracksystem.com. You don't have to be doing it for exam prep. We have a Mastering the NEC program where you can just learn more about the NEC and just make you better and more proficient at your job. And again, the easier things are to do, the more you learn, the easier they are, the less it feels like you're working. Okay. You're just doing it. So, okay. The next one is we're going to look at 300.24. That's the 360-degree rule, continues through raceway transitions. Now, this is an excellent code change that we need to talk about here, because previously each individual raceway article contained its own 360-degree limitation, right? So it didn't matter which one you were in, whether it was EMT, whether it was rigid metal, intermediate metal, PVC. They all had their own specific rules for individual raceways where you not have more than 360 degrees worth of bends between pull points. So basically from pull point A to pull point B, you can't have more than 490s. Or you could have accumulation of offsets and angles and 90s. You couldn't exceed 360-degree bends, okay? But previously somebody could argue that 360 degrees of bends in EMT transition to RMC, then another 360 degrees before the next pull point. Okay, because they could argue that it was only per the different type of wiring method or raceway. So if you changed raceways, then it caused the math to start over again. So if I had 360 degrees of EMT, and then I used a transition fitting instead of a box, which wasn't a pull point, and then transition to RMC, that I could also do another 360 degrees before I got to the pull point. That is not what was meant to say. Okay, so 300.24 closes that argument now. The total bends in any combination of conduit or tubing wiring methods used for a single run cannot exceed 360 degrees between pull points. Again, the pull points, when you're transitioning between one wiring method to another, that is not a pull point. So it should have never been an argument. It's in the run itself. But you can see where people want to bring these arguments up. And then, of course, if that's the case, we need clarity. And that's why we clarify. So if I have to give a visual, a mental picture for this, if we have two pull boxes, so we have two 90-degree EMT bends, that's 180, because each 90 is 180. And then we transition, let's say, over to RMC, depending on where it's going to go. Maybe it needs to transition, and now it needs to go to an area that needs a little more protection, so it transitions to RMC. And then it has two additional 90-degree bends in the RMC. That's another 180 degrees for a total of 360 degrees. So no additional bends is permitted before another pull point. Okay, so the raceway type transition does not reset that bend count. So that is significant. Because there are people that have challenged that. Now, you may not challenge it. I may not challenge it. And I can promise you, the more bends you have, the harder as hell that pull is going to be. But if I had to go and have 4 bends in an EMT and I transition to an RMC and I put 4 more bends in it, we're talking 890s in a pull, you're hard pressed to get anything through there. And if you could get it through, there's a high probability you're going to damage the sidewall of that conductor anyway. And you're asking for a problem, okay? So this just makes it a little easier to be able to make sure that this is enforced properly, the way it was supposed to be enforced, okay? All right. Now we're going to do an honorable mention right here because I think this is significant for many people. The previous requirement in the 2023 under 300.4G, you might remember it's the fitting requirement, where in the 2023 edition of the NEC, and I'm actually read this to you, it's fittings. It says, where raceways contain 4 AWG and larger insulated circuit conductors, and these conductors enter a cabinet, a box, an enclosure, or a raceway. Now, here's the part that was added in the 2023. It says, prior to the installation of the conductors shall be protected in accordance with any of the following. So prior to the installation, you had to make sure that you had the fitting on there. And in most cases, this was a bushing in order to protect the conductors prior to the actual installation. Okay, so in the 2026 edition of the NEC, the 2026 removed the timing language. Okay, so in the 2023, you had to, when you're pulling conductors in the raceway and they were 4-gauge and larger insulated conductors, you had to have a bushing in place. Now, this doesn't remove the bushing requirement, so let's not get confused here. It's all about the timing of the bushing. So it used to say that you had to have everything in place prior. And so some of the manufacturers came out with those, kind of those hinge type of bushings, and you couldn't use them because it needed to be in place before you pulled the conductors. But a lot of the pulling equipment actually had a sleeve that fit down actually into the actual raceway. And so you really had the protection there. So one of the big changes here is it removed the statement about being in place prior. Okay, so this change means that permanent protective fittings or insulated material does not necessarily have to be physically installed before the actual pull. For example, when pulling equipment provides that protection based on how that they would go, have maybe the end of it goes down in the raceway, and you could end up putting a split or a hinged bushing on after the installation, not prior to the installation. Still have to have the bushing, still have to follow the rules under 300.5G for fittings. You still have to follow that, and it could be integral into the fitting. A bushing could provide this, and you still also have other types of bushing requirements in the other specific code articles for those types of wiring methods. But this is just a timing thing. It means that you can put the bushing on after, because the pulling equipment, okay, would add that protection during the pull itself. Now, if you're just pulling by hand and things like that, then I'd say be careful, because obviously you damage it, and you saw what we said earlier. If an inspector thinks it's damaged, then it's going to be removed. So just be careful. But this removes the timing aspect of it. And some pulling equipment do have sleeves that go down it that literally will protect it as it comes through. Okay? And a lot of the fittings today still have protection, rounded edges on them and things like that. So again, this is just a little common sense, but it just removed the timing aspect. It did not remove the protection requirements. It just removed the timing of when you would need to use them. You get what I'm saying? Okay, that's why I just wanted to be like an honorable mention rather than something significant. Okay. Let's see here. 300.9A. Additional methods to prevent condensation. Now, formerly, this was in 300.7a, and it mainly relied on sealing the raceway or sleeve to prevent warm air circulation into the colder section and creating moisture. Now, the 2026 edition permits either. One, you can have appropriate sealant, and there's a lot of manufacturers that duct seal, Polywater makes some great products that can change or break that air exchange to prevent condensation. But it also says a listed fitting or other approved means identified for preventing condensation and warm air circulation is fine. So a thermal brake coupling is identified as an example of this. Now, this is an allowance rather than a new burden. Okay, it didn't change the fact that you have that condensation issue for the warm air, the cold air. It's just giving you more options to be able to apply that seal. That's it. Okay. That's all it's really doing there. Next, 300.10, which is formerly 300.8. And this is the foreign system prohibition now expressly includes cables. So what are we talking about? Now, in 300.8, it prohibited non-electrical piping or tubing in raceways or cable trays containing electrical conductors. Now, in the 2026, wording now expressly includes raceways and cable trays containing electrical conductors or cables. Therefore, placing an NM cable, an NC cable, an SE cable, or similar cable assembly inside a raceway does not create a loophole allowing water, gas, pneumatic, or drainage piping in that raceway. You get what I'm saying? So in the past, you could have tried to circumvent this by putting an NM cable with its own sheathing inside of it and creating a separation and saying, well, it's a cable assembly and it's in the same raceway, but it's separated because the cable has its own sheathing or armor. That loophole that was in there is gone now, okay? So you're not going to be able to put gas, water, pneumatic, drain piping, and all that stuff in the raceway, even if you have a different type of cable assembly in there and you try to play that game and saying, well, I can put it in there because the cable is in its own wiring method and it's inside of the raceway. It's not going to work. Okay, so that doesn't create a loophole allowing you to put water, gas, pneumatic. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And again, that was something that was clarified by the Steel Tube Institute in kind of making that thing clear. And of course, it got into the National Electrical Code just for clarity. Next, 300.17F, which is accessibility depends on whether the fitting is used as a pull point. Now, former 300.15F required that fittings to remain accessible unless listed for concealment installations. Okay, so again, a good example of this fitting may be a 90-degree fitting, and it was required to be accessible unless it was actually listed for a concealment application. Now, the 2026 language says that the fitting must be accessible if it is used as a pull point. A fitting used only as a transition and not relied upon as a pull point may be concealed where otherwise permitted. Okay, so it removes the fact that you could have had this fitting and maybe a 90 fitting that was transition fitting, but it wasn't going to be used as a pull point. So it removes the requirement for that to now be considered accessible, okay, or listed for concealment. Example, FMC 90s used as a pull point, they must still remain accessible if you're using that FMC 90 as a legitimate pull point, okay? Now, underground PVC to RMC transition fitting assembly before burial and not used as a pull point, accessibility is not automatically required by this provision. So that's just a transition fitting. There's many people that have argued if you're going from a PVC to RMC as a transition fitting, then it needs to be assembled before burial and not used as a pull point, then it does not trigger the fact that it needs to have accessibility. Just do it, put it together, follow instructions, and bury it, okay? So again, extremely important to separate the two, okay? All right, so that's going to wrap it up for this episode, folks. Hopefully you saw, obviously, to be more familiar with the National Electrical Code, take the time. Maybe I didn't go into some of these as deep as you wanted me to go into. Obviously, I can't cover every aspect of the changes that are in 300, but I encourage you to take the time to look at it. And of course, if there's any questions you have, you can always go to the Let's Ask Paul forum. And also, by the way, since I am going to be writing articles and doing videos and doing podcasts for EC&M Magazine as their NEC consultant, feel free to email me something and it may appear in one of those episodes and, where we can basically clear up what maybe the masses don't understand about certain things in the National Electrical Code. But that's what we're going to use that platform for. I think EC&M Magazine is a great platform to teach people the electrical code and applications, and we're going to do our best to kind of bridge the gap between electrical inspectors and electricians, and we're going to get into all of that, and we're going to make it exciting. So we want to move from this point on, as of July of 2026, we're going to make EC&M Magazine, broaden them a little bit. We're going to get into inspections and talk about all those things. I'm excited about the opportunity. There's great folks over there. I encourage you to subscribe to EC&M Magazine. There's going to be some great things. Ryan Jackson's going to be doing some articles for them as well. He's a very knowledgeable individual, so that's going to be great. But again, we can't cover everything, and some people would like us to cover every topic. But again, we have to pick and choose, and we have to make sure that we keep it flowing. So we'll do the best we can. So until next time, folks, stay safe, God bless, and catch us all on the next episode of Master the NEC, the podcast. Till next time, stay safe.
Thanks for tuning into another electrifying episode of the Master the NEC podcast. We hope you're feeling more powered up and ready to tackle the electrical world with the knowledge and confidence you need to succeed. Remember, in the electrical trade, knowledge is power, and we're here to make sure you stay plugged into the latest insights, tips, and code updates. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share the podcast with your fellow electricians and industry pros. Until next time, keep your tools sharp, your circuits clear, and your mind focused, because here at the Master the NEC podcast, we're all about sparking your success. Stay safe, stay smart, and keep mastering the trade. From all of us here at Electrical Code Academy, thank you for all your support, and we will see you on the next amazing Master the NEC podcast episode.